So welcome everybody to the State Non-Credit Data Project Learning Community Meeting. My name is Michelle Vanoy, Director of the Education and Employment Research Center, and helping to lead the State Non-Credit Data Project along with several other key leaders here today. And just thrilled that you all are joining us for this moment. I'm just going to give a really quick background on the State Non-Credit Data Project in case there's anybody joining us today for the first time. So we'll just jump to the next slide and I will just give you a quick overview of the project. For those of you who've been around a while, you can sit back for a second. But just to give everybody an overview of what the project goals are, we're really multiple goals here with this project. We're trying to do some research basically to better understand non-credit and help to advance the development of non-credit data. So we're trying to document what's out there. And through documenting what states are doing around non-credit data, we've been working to build a national data taxonomy that we hope will be useful in guiding national, state, and institutional efforts around building non-credit data. So we last year released our second version of the non-credit data taxonomy, and we are now working on a 3.0 that we expect will be available this spring, really building on what we've learned and incorporating more different perspectives and types of data to help guide non-credit data development. And then, of course, the third goal, which is what we're all here today to gather around, is promoting peer learning. We really want to facilitate what we're learning from our research and also help to build networks to share knowledge across states as folks are working on building up their data. So we have this quarterly learning community meeting, as well as state specialized working groups, which you'll hear more about later from folks that are leading those, Paul Innocent and Amy Cable. So we'll just go to the next slide. I'll just give you a real quick overview of some of the activities of the project over time. We started off with 3 states that had fairly advanced systems of non-credit data collection, which were Iowa, Louisiana, and Virginia. And through that, like I said, we documented the data available and began building out the non-credit data taxonomy. We expanded out to other research partners over the years, Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, South Carolina, and Tennessee, which included states with a range of different data, different stages of development, and really tried to learn from what each of those states were doing, including many of these included community college data, but we also have State Department of Labor represented in there to really round out the taxonomy. Now on this current phase of the project, we're seeking additional research partner states that give us a broader range of types of non-credit data in terms of the entities that are involved, including departments of labor, four-year institutions, private providers, apprenticeship, and a variety of other kinds of entities. And we are, as I said, working on updating the national data taxonomy. In addition, we are also doing some further analyses and research that we hope will be helpful resources to the field, including a scan of state policies around non-credit. So some of you on this call may get an email from me or from Mark D'Amico, another close colleague on this project, inviting you to be part of that. That will go to a certain number of folks within states. And we also are doing some analysis of state governance structures around non-credit. So some of our research partner states are contributing to that effort as well. So that's just kind of a quick overview of some of the things that are happening on the project overall. I don't want to spend too much more time speaking about that. I want to get us to the content of the meeting, but I do want to share just some of the publications and resources that we have available from the project that if you want to take a deeper look, our taxonomy, across-state analysis of states and their non-credit data, as well as briefs from each of the states, as well as practice briefs that highlight dashboards, data systems, and partnerships. So it's all available on our website. So without any further ado, I want to turn things over to really today's agenda for the meeting. We wanted to just spend a little bit of time. We know lots of things are going on in the field, and part of what we want to do is facilitate sharing of information and updates. And so we are going to have a quick update on the development of some of the data resources from Credlin. So I know Elliot Gillerman is here today and prepared to spend a little bit of time sharing with everybody some of the work there. And I think Stacy may or may not be here, but I know Elliot for sure will be here. And then what we're going to spend the bulk of our time today together on is talking more about workforce Pell implementation. We know that's top of mind for many, many people here. And so we're really grateful to have Paula Nissen and Amy Cable here to share some of what they've been learning from working with folks in the States in their specialized working groups. So I'm going to turn things over to Elliot, and it looks like I think Caitlin is here maybe to in Stacy's absence. So
Yes. Hi.
Kate, hi Kate. So now I'm trying to remember if you had slides. Were you going to share slides or were you
We
going
do
to
have
you do
slides.
have slides?
Yes.
Okay. So Amy will pull hers down for a second and you can pop yours up.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, Michelle, thank you for the tee up and thank you all for joining. I see lots of friends on this call, so it's good to see some familiar faces. And if everyone could maybe go on mute just to make sure we don't have any background noise. Thank you. So good to see some friends and some new faces here too. I'm going to spend some time just going through a bit of kind of just scene setting and context setting on who Credlens is, the work that we're doing, and again for some of you this may be familiar, maybe the second or third or fourth time you've seen some of these slides, but want to make sure everyone has that context. And then Michelle, remind me just on timing. We've got like 15, 20 minutes. Is that right? I want to make sure I respect the agenda.
About 15 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'll try to go through this, in 7, 8 minutes or so, and then leave some time for questions. And Kate Smolkin, who's our Vice President of Engagement, is also here. So she and I will tag team. Sadly, Stacy is sick, so she is not here today. But just for folks I have not met yet, I'm Elliot, our Senior Vice President of Strategy and Insights. So what I do at Credlens is all things product and platform, and then also work with our third-party data partners. And I'll talk more about what that means in a moment. So with that, I'm going to bring up the slides. And can you all see this? Great. All right, we'll get into it. So again, just wanted to set some background and context on Credlens for folks who we have not met before. I know that everyone who is on this call is here because just how large and important the role of non-degree credentials are in the labor market. But we always like to start here just because for some folks this is a new story. What Credlens was really started to focus in on and the problem to solve was just bringing transparency and better understanding to this large and yet opaque slice of the education market. Just some quick stats that every time I see these, I'm just astounded. But according to some federal surveys, about 80 million Americans hold some form of sub-baccalaureate credentials that are covered by 20,000 and more probably organizations in the space. I know according to the latest update from Harvard's Workforce Almanac, and they're growing really quickly. And so, our view of the world is, these are not just sort of one-off credentials. They are, strategic investments that individuals are making, whether they're stacking them with the bachelor's degree or pursuing them as a signal in the labor market when they're looking to maybe change careers or get promoted at work. And so they provide a really important role and signal in the labor market. But, one of the challenges is despite the potential impact that they can have, a lot of stakeholders and folks in this space are held back by the lack of accessible outcomes data. So first and foremost, what we call credential issuers. So any institution, whether it's a community college or a training provider, a workforce development organization, or a certification body. In most cases, like organizations really want to access data, but it's hard to access unless you have easy access to UI wage data, which I imagine some of the folks on this call do. A lot of the orgs that we work with are sending out surveys and they get 10 or 15% response rates, but they're really, like the quality is pretty mixed. And you also likely get a lot of sample bias in the responses. And so that's really hard to scale over the long term. Secondly, and again, I don't need to tell too many folks on this call this point, but for a lot of state leaders here, whether you're sitting in state government or you're part of a statewide system, there's just the challenge of integrating the non-degree credentials into the full data stack, whether they live in a separate SIS and therefore are hard to connect to longitudinal data. the challenge is pretty numerous there. And then lastly, we're also talking to folks in broader industry, whether they're certification bodies or also employers and other trade associations who, oftentimes are talking about, hey, like we would love to enable skills-based hiring, but we don't have a great currency for talking about what are the underlying skills connected to some of these credentials and what outcomes do they really drive in terms of employment and where folks end up working. And so, the holdback of all this is, this phrase Wild West is often thrown around. And what we see, and like we hear this directly from a lot of our partners, is look, we use non-degree credentials to really drive innovation in the space. And we are big believers in the potential for that innovation, but we also believe that data is at the heart of it. And so, with better information and just better understanding of which credentials lead to which outcomes in the labor market, we think that they can play a very critical role in driving innovation and helping to connect more people to more access to opportunity, which is a big motivation for all of us. So what is CredLens? We are a national nonprofit data trust. The idea of a data trust is a formal legal concept. Sometimes I have to remind folks of that. But essentially, the idea is, we're an organization that's out there collecting and managing data in the public interest. And so, the foundational work that we do is partnering with organizations to first and foremost, access and store their attainment data on their non-degree credentials, but then use that data to provide value back to our partners in the form of outcomes data. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Just some other kind of principles around, our role as a data trust. One is, we're a neutral steward of sensitive data. So we're asking our partners for, sensitive personal information, but, we're not sharing that. We're not monetizing it. We're not publishing it without consent from our partners. It is not our data. It's their data. Number two, as I said a moment ago, a big part of our focus is on transparency and driving public good. So, we believe that the organizations sharing data with us should have access to their own outcomes data, and ultimately, reports and research and other things like that in partnership with our clients and partners is a big area of focus for us. And then lastly, privacy, reliability, and accountability, and how the data is shared and used are bedrock principles that really inform our approach. So, what is it that we actually do? At our core, we have a software platform. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we work with credential issuers, again, nonprofit training org, certification bodies, and other education institutions. And what we'll ask you for is, first your alumni data on who's earning different credentials, non-degree credentials. And then part two, in the bottom left here, what we do with that data is we match that against third-party outcomes data sources. So we're taking data, we're matching and enriching it, and in some cases sharing it with our partners to do that. We then get back the aggregate results of those matches and analyze and format those into data visualizations, reports, and dashboards that we populate in a software platform, which you see in this beautiful laptop slide in the middle here. What we then focus on through the product and through the data available in it is providing insight into outcomes across three different categories. So the first is earnings, helping folks understand, for a cohort of people who earn a given credential, how much money do they make over time? What's the ROI? And eventually, how do those compare to other benchmarks for similar credentials? Part two is employment. So what are the career pathways? Where are people working by industry, by company, by occupation? What are the rates of employment? And increasingly, what we're focused on is digging in on job alignment. So, someone earned a cybersecurity credential, but they're working as a frontline retail associate, we would consider that not aligned. And so, providing insight into the share of folks working in aligned roles. And then the third one, and this takes a couple different forms, is education. So one is, understanding what's the overlap between, folks who earned one credential and then went on to earn another credential that was part of a pathway. So if you earned a certificate that was meant to lead to a certification, what share of folks went on to earn that second certification? And then the other one is the interplay between non-degree credentials and degree credentials. So Melissa Buckley from National Student Clearinghouse is here. We've had great conversations with the clearinghouse about tapping into their data as a source for those degree credentials or degrees. And so, that's another use case that we're very focused on. Next slide. I've got one or two more, I promise, then I'm gonna pause. This is just kind of a quick list of some of the research questions that we seek to answer in the product, so similar to what I just called out. But I'll end on two more very briefly. One is, I want to really underscore this point that, one of the things that we really focus on and we think is kind of a foundational principle that really drives our work is just the importance of starting with verified data, right? Like not saying we're going to infer who's earning different credentials. We go direct to the source. And so as we partner with institutions and issuers, that reliance on verified data, I think gives us, a focus on quality that really matters when you start thinking downstream about the insights that we're calculating. And then very last slide, and then I'll take them down. We can have a conversation, is just this question of like, how do we work with states? Like if you're interested in working with CredLens, and again, some of our partners are on this call, how might we work together? So, one thing that we've really focused on is delivering occupation level insights. So, as most of you know, unless you're in a state that's collecting enhanced wage records, you have employment data, but it doesn't get down to the occupation level. That's a place that we can be helpful on. Two, as I was talking about, is industry credential and certification tracking. So, as I mentioned earlier, the example of, folks who earned say, a cybersecurity certificate as part of a program that was meant to lead to a CompTIA certification, providing insight into that pathway and the share of folks who are completing that pathway. And then part three. Obviously, this is a moving target, and we're going to talk about this in the rest of the presentation, I know. But Workforce Pell, one of the things that we're in some early exploratory conversations around is, hey, with our outcomes data sources, are there ways that we could be helpful in informing, initial eligibility determination? Obviously, NEGREG is not final yet, and so we want to be very careful about going out and saying, like, we have all the right sources, we have all the right information, but just as an initial perspective, once institutions have gone through kind of program and administrative determinations. When you look specifically at the employment and value-added earnings outcomes measurements, we think those are places we could be helpful as well. So, last thing I'll say, and then I'll take these slides down, is, would love to have some follow-up conversations. I'll put my email and Kate's email in the chat. And if you are interested in chatting more with us, we would love to continue the conversation. But with that, I'm going to take the slides down and happy to answer any questions.
Elliot, we can start with one in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw from Kim. Did you say that you verify that the student earns the IBC? Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of the roadmap, Elliot, and where we're headed with that, with credential?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, good question, Kim. So the short answer is yes. So, and the way that we do this is I mentioned verified data earlier. So when we have industry partners, based certification partners sharing data with us, one of the use cases we talk to them about is, hey, are you comfortable also sharing data with other institutional partners? And so that is very much of interest to them. And so, again, that focus on verified data means like we need to have data from each of the certification bodies before we can pass that and obviously make sure that we're going through, data approval and we are totally above board on being transparent about who's sharing data with whom and whose data are you seeing. But yes, that is something that we can do. And yeah, anyway, I will leave it there. And then let's see, there's another question, occupation data. So right now we are pulling data from a couple different companies that are scraping LinkedIn and other social media profiles. So People Data Labs, Stepping Blocks, a couple others, and again, provide us data at the occupation level. One of the things that we're working on right now is kind of updating and developing our own approach to job taxonomy. So SOC codes obviously are pretty standard. We've heard from some of our partners that there are some limitations, especially when you get into like healthcare roles and pharmacy roles. So we're doing some R&D into what's the right taxonomy. So kind of in the weeds, but I assume folks here will be interested in that. I'm just going to keep talking because there are great questions in the chat. Try to do rapid fire. Let's see, talk more about how you measure stacking. Yes, Susanna, that's exactly right. So, and we're literally designing this feature now. I was talking to our designer just before this call about how we're approaching this. But yeah, so the way we're thinking about this is, I see Gina from Ivy Tech on, so I'll use Ivy Tech as an example. Like Ivy Tech can say, hey, for this program, we know that this certification is meant to map to it. And so that definition and that sort of mapping are made sort of at the credential level. And then if we have data for that credential that the mapping is tied to, we're calculating like what percentage of folks who are earning the first credential then go on to earn the second credential. Does that make sense? Cool.
Also, Elliot, I don't know if you hit this one, but the occupation data sources, so talking a little bit about employment sources, did you see that one as well?
Yeah, I
Awesome.
answered that one.
Beautiful.
Who pays for this service? That is a great question. So we, for the last year or so, have been in what we've called alpha partner mode. So essentially, as a new organization, I think I missed this, I'm realizing, but we were founded about 18 months ago. So we are startup-y in our age. We were essentially working, for free with early partners who were signed up and partnering with us. We are now moving to a model in the first or second quarter of next year where we're bringing on a whole new set of features. We're calling premium features, and there will be a fee for those. There will always be a sort of a free tier that's available, and we're putting the final touches on like what's in premium versus what's in the free tier. But the headline is there is a fee for access to the platform. We're finalizing pricing. So if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to me and Kate.
Yep. And the idea is this is kind of important framing. Like we envision this, being a public utility, right? And so that's the reason there's always going to be a free layer. Also, we are an impact organization. We are, trying to be sustainable and keep the lights on, right? I think it's an important framing given the stakeholders we work with and the various communities. That's something we really want to drive home to folks.
Yep. Kat, I see your question in the chat. It's a great point, and it is a really important one. I think one of the things that we're still learning about this is what is the coverage from different sources and how does it vary by sector? And so, our team is very much still in R&D and learning mode on that. So it's one of the things that every time we get a matched data set in from different credentials and different sectors that are covered by those credentials, we're looking back and mapping that so that we can get smart and learn. I will say, I mean, this is very anecdotal, but we have been pleasantly surprised. Like I was, again, just candidly, I was expecting, every credential we see in the trades to have like very low match rates. And that has not been the case. Depends a bit on, kind of what level we're talking about, but it's not as simple a story as you might expect, where it's like one industry always has terrible match rates, but other industries have higher ones. I think it depends a lot on the population. So I think your point about rural workers, that may be one where we see lower match rates, but we're still learning and so far have not seen like consistently across the board really low match rates consistently. But I think over the next quarter or two, we're going to keep learning a lot more.
Great. Well, that was a real crash course in all the good work that you are doing. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's any other burning questions or any last words, Kate or Elliot, before we move on to our next
Yeah, I
topic.
did. I did see one last question here as a follow-on, which I think is important. And it's a very good point, right? About kind of the self-reported nature of social media and LinkedIn. That said, I think, what we found so far is that as far as the accuracy, it tends to really be kind of in that most recent employment, right? So let's just say I left a job, I haven't yet landed a new one. I'm going to have more of a tendency to potentially not update my profile. It may not be accurate. It may say I'm still working at a job where I've actually left. So we find if you kind of go back 6 to 9 months, it becomes much more accurate. But it's a good point, right? It's a good call out. And Elliot, I'm not sure if there's anything else you would kind of say to that to close out.
Yeah, I think you hit it. Thank you all. Great questions. I feel like I was just
Yeah,
talking nonstop, but really
this is
good
great.
rapid fire in the chat.
All important questions and very good to know. So I guess if you have contact info you want to put out there for everybody if they want to follow up and
Yes,
get
we'll
more
drop
info.
that.
And
Drop that
I
in.
will hand things over to Amy Cable and Paula Nissen to share all the lessons from the state specialized working groups that they've been gaining.
Hello, everyone. This is Paula Nissen, and I am with the Institutional Research Collaborative of North Central Iowa, and also a team member of Team SNDP. So very proud to be that. Next slide, Amy. Just kind of give you an overview update on how the specialized working groups are going, and I want to thank a lot of you that have been attending those. They've been very successful. We did a survey initially, a little bit background here to find out what 3 things you really wanted to learn about in the first few sessions that we've scheduled. those are coming close to an end. Actually, we started last March, and those will be ending in January, February of this year, with others to follow. So we will be scheduling new meetings based on interest from those of you that are on this call. So if you have something that you'd like to see us concentrating on for new specialized working groups coming up, we'd be happy to take those into account. And then we also have designed a website for the partners, just to let you know that those partners can participate and find all the resources, videos, and presentations that they either were able to attend or maybe had missed. So that's also a resource for our specialized working groups. Next slide. Just to cover what those actually are, if some of you don't know, the first one is with the Data Collection 101 with Vladimir Bassis from Iowa. And I know Vlad's on the call. Thank you, Vlad, for all the work you've done. His sessions identified around identification of needs, planning the infrastructure, scope and connectivity of data collection, reporting manual details, and then the automation of reporting. Coming up in January, his last session will be on the assessment of planned tasks and goals. So that's really been informative for those states, especially that are dealing with just new data collection or trying to figure out which direction to go. So I thank you for that. Next slide. And then I've been doing aligning of labor market and education data. So defining the data sources and linkages, importance of correct zip codes, identifying the data needs and crosswalk, and basically performing a how-to online with the folks that have been participating. And I can tell you just from my viewpoint that there's been about 37 states that have been participating in those sessions. And I want to thank you all very much for that. My next session will be on non-credit outcomes, where I'll be highlighting our partnership with PSEO and also highlighting some of the states that have been doing outcomes work, such as Iowa. So Vlad will be my presenter of choice for that one so far. And then that'll be December 12th. And then we'll be doing assessment and presentations on lessons learned in February. So taking folks as, volunteer to do that would be great. I've got one so far, looking for more. Next slide. And then, of course, Amy Cable, who you'll be hearing from here shortly, and she's been doing sessions on policy and governance for non-credit best practices, looking at sample MOUs, legislation, data standardization and governance, building strategic partners. And then we have been concentrating solely lately on workforce Pell and exploring what that means for all of us. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, I think. And, oh, wait, what's next? We'll send out some more surveys and find out what everybody wants to know for the new specialized working groups. And in addition to designing an implementation of a four-year college or university specialized working groups. So we're really looking forward to doing that, see what that's all about, learning more. And then the development of resources for workforce short-term Pell. So now I guess I'll hand it over to Amy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paula. Thank you guys for having me. Amy Cable. I am the Chief Student Affairs Officer at the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. And as Paula mentioned, I helped with the policy standpoint from the working group. So we did a lot about MOUs, data sharing agreements, who to bring to the table. And our most recent one, we really talked about short-term Pell and workforce Pell implementation. And interestingly enough, the AHEAD negotiated rulemaking started today. And so as I've had meetings, I've been trying to listen in. So as I can, kind of weave some things that I'm learning out of those negotiated rulemaking meetings throughout this, I certainly will. So let's go through here. I'm going to skip through a few of these slides, but really what we want to touch on today is really high level, what we have seen that have come out from the legislative update. And then we also did a survey of some states that are in that smaller working group, just to kind of do an assessment of where the states really are on how prepared they feel for workforce Pell. And then we'll talk through just some things to be thinking about as you start kind of diving down this little new world. So really quick from an overview perspective, the Workforce Pell has a defined timeline for rollout and implementation. So we're in negotiated rulemaking this week, and then they will reconvene in January. The goal is that this would be implemented by July 1 of 2026. And that was assuming that all rules were in place. I do anticipate that there probably will be some push to have some programs eligible by that July 1, 2026. In Louisiana in particular, we're hoping that we will have our programs already identified. Our biggest challenge is what's going to happen externally to us, right? Like, are our systems going to be ready to go, or is the Department of Ed going to be ready to take these programs and to approve them? They have kind of established some eligibility criteria that I will talk about here in a few minutes. A lot of accountability metrics. So, 70% completion rate, 70% job placement rate, and then what the state certification and oversight will look like. So really high level, the basics are that this is a need-based program for students attending programs at an accredited institution of at least 150 contact or clock hours in 8 weeks. So today, under the current regulations, it's 600 clock hours over 16 weeks. And so this substantially changes what the eligible programs will look like. There are a little bit of different criteria for students who are, receive bachelor's degrees, if students need remedial coursework, and all of those different eligibility criteria are being discussed this week through negotiated rulemaking. As I mentioned before, it is set to begin July 1, and there are short-term course programs that do meet some of the guardrails, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So a little bit of the guardrails is like it cannot be a correspondence course. You cannot count remedial coursework, as I mentioned before. Your governor is going to be kind of like that oversight entity that will help determine the eligible programs for those in-demand areas. Now, your governor may decide that he may appoint particular, entities or councils that you may already have existing in your state. And that's something that is actually being discussed during negotiated rulemaking. There are things to look at about how your employer hiring the criteria. It does seem to be stackable and portable. So if you have like a non-credit credential, does it, track and stack towards a credit credential or a credit program? It does need to be offered for at least 1 year. So this may be a challenge for folks if you've never offered a program, because there is some like look back data that you have to kind of take into account. But if you've never offered it, that may be a little bit of a challenge. And then the completion rate of 70% or higher within 150% of a normal time period, and then post-completion job placement rates. Also within 180 days after following completion, and then costs. So looking at tuition and fees. So as I mentioned before, that AHEAD group, or the Accountability in Higher Education and Access through Demand-Driven Workforce Pell. So they began meeting today. And so far they've talked about, remedial coursework, students who already are in receipt of a bachelor's degree, but want to pursue a credential that is not at the graduate level. So they talked substantially about that already. They started talking a little bit about student eligibility. Definition of programs. There's a lot of discussion today around apprenticeship programs and kind of how that plays into all of this. There's also some discussion around like program eligibility definition, specifically in how the Higher Education Act defines program eligibility versus how WIOA defines program eligibility. And so that is something that I think is going to have to be clarified as they're working through negotiated rulemaking, because there are differences in those definitions. And then, of course, the role of the governor's office, they started to think through that. You can access a copy of the draft verbiage from the link that I emailed you guys, or that I put in the chat, and you can sign up for negotiated rulemaking to review it. But a couple of areas to bring to your attention: definition of eligible workforce program, page 16. Governor approval of programs starts on page 20. So think a lot about what new policies you may need to be putting in place at the state level. And then reporting requirements to both the governor and to the Secretary of Education starts on page 27. So there was a question in the chat about the cost and tuition earnings do not exceed value added earnings. So it's looking at the poverty level. So if a student graduates with a credential and then they're looking at that earning, and they're also looking at the poverty level earning, and you essentially can't charge more for tuition based on those two figures. So if your poverty level is $25,000 and your what the student is earning is going to be, let's see, $28,000. You can't charge more than $3,000 for that particular program. But again, a lot of this is still being vetted through negotiated rulemaking. So just know that more things are coming. And I believe there was a comment in the chat that probably alluded to that. So like I mentioned before, we did do a survey. We really wanted to try to understand like the landscape of what is happening at states, right? What are you actually doing today? What is your readiness for workforce Pell implementation? And so what we found throughout the survey is that states are starting to think about it. It is developing, but some states are more ready than others. And then most states report that they're either in the early to mid stages of planning with strong awareness of the requirements, but limited operational alignment so far. Several states have already established cross-agency working groups that are assessing program eligibility, and while others are just waiting on federal guidance. So I'll give you an example. In Louisiana, we already have a working group, an advisory council that reviews program eligibility for a state scholarship program. And so we're going to use that same council to vet eligibility for workforce. And we've already started thinking about how we're going to draft the language to our governor to assign that particular council to vet those programs. We also have just a small working group to just kind of think preliminarily, okay, who needs to be at the table? What do the letters need to say? Do we need to make edits to those? And then eventually that smaller working group will go away and that advisory council will really take over. Again, several states have established cross-agency working groups. Let's see, and let's see what else I was going to mention here. Some common needs that are based on the surveys, really just federal clarification, right? So that's why this ahead negotiated rulemaking is super important, because we're hoping that we'll get some clarity around what some of the language is, so we know how to actually implement this program. They're looking for peer examples. So if you are a state that already has some existing infrastructure, please share that. And then any technical assistance that you may have. Doing some assessment of, what short-term programs might actually already be eligible. So, kind of already doing some scans. And then also thinking about like your financial aid, your data system infrastructure, what maybe your Board of Regents or your Workforce Commission is looking like, because a lot of those areas are going to impact how we do this work. And then, of course, your policy standpoint as well. What state policies are going to need to be, updated? What federal policies are going to need to be updated? So we actually learned quite a bit for this very small survey that we sent out. So now we'll talk and these are really more just like guided questions to be thinking about, as you work through your institutional alignment and partnership, who needs to be at the table when you're starting to think through your task forces, or what partnerships that you have to have. Are there MOU or data, sharing agreements that you need to update? What are your data systems starting to look like? So as you're thinking in the seat that you are currently in, how are you able to align those priorities with your agency, with Workforce Pell? Are there partnerships that currently exist that you need to have strengthened, or are partnerships that you need to build out? So what what are states really doing to start aligning some of these programs with the eligibility for workforce Pell? I think you're going to find that there's going to have to be a lot of coordination amongst those major, bodies. So your higher education, maybe your Office of Financial Aid, your workforce agencies. So a lot of collaboration and partnerships at that level. Survey data, or I'm sorry, data. So what did we really learn about the survey about our data is that our data is shaping how we do things, right? So we kind of are starting to see that states are starting to collect non-credit information. How does that now inform what we're going to do in the workforce Pell space? Some data components that states are probably going to struggle with potentially are the difficulties with wage and job placement data. So one thing that we've already started to notice and think about in Louisiana is so the completion rate, 70%. Well, that's traditionally you have to have both enrollment and completions in order to do that calculation. Well, we've not traditionally reported enrollment to our Board of Regents. We've done student level data at the completion rate. So now we're kind of looking at what data we report to the Board of Regents because we want to send all of our enrollments and our completers to that body so then they can share that information with our Workforce Commission, who will then maybe able to calculate those job placement rates. So that, it's kind of like what data are you currently collecting and then what data aren't you collecting that you will need in order to do these particular calculations. Let's see what else. I think that's pretty much it from a data perspective. It's really just how do you have the data? Where do you collect it right now? How are your entities going to use that data to kind of effectively review program eligibility? And then what are data needs that you might have, and how can this working group in the future maybe help you with those?
Amy, one more point, and
Mhm.
for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim from Louisiana. I work with Amy quite a bit. The 150% of time is sometimes difficult because while we have clock hours, we don't have what the traditional, 2-year, 4-year, what 150% of that is. So if it's converted, if it's a weekend class or a weekend program, then obviously that's going to take longer. So states are going to really need to be thinking about what 150% of time is when the criteria is based on clock hours, not necessarily how, I mean, it says 8 weeks and then so many clock hours, but they'll kind of have to be converted to some kind of typical way the program is offered.
Right. That's a great point. Thank you, Kim.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that kind of came up in the survey is really around like messaging to students. I mean, this is another aid program that students may be eligible for. So, now you've got regular Pell, workforce Pell, maybe your state programs, you have other federal programs. You have WIOA. So it's really about how do we message this to students. I personally would love, I said, I want a platform that you can enter a student's information and it goes beep, boop, and it tells me what they would be eligible for. I don't know that we're going to get there just yet, but that would be ideally something that you would want to think through is how do you evaluate, eligibility for the student for all of these multiple types of programs? And how do you really start thinking through messaging, FAFSA completion? There are going to be programs that are going to be eligible for Pell where students have never completed a FAFSA before, and now they're going to have to. How do you engage your advising model into those discussions? So lots of things to be thinking about as it relates to messaging to students. So this section here really just kind of talks through like some implementation challenges. How are you going to define those high quality programs? Again, what metrics are you going to be using? How are you navigating that approval process? Because even once your college gets or your state gets through, say, our advisory council where they say, okay, these programs are eligible, each institution still has to work through the process that the department requires. And so what did those processes look like, and are they going to be ready? Your data infrastructure, all of our non-credit data at LCTCS is in one system along with our credit. So we're able to pull much more robust information about our non-credit workforce programs that we offer. If your state's not doing that right now, you may have infrastructure gaps where you may not be able to even know what programs could be eligible because you don't have the data to support it. And then just regulatory timeline. I mean, it's a very fast moving train, right? And so they're meeting this week. They're going to come back in January, and it's going to be boom, 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 because you want to be prepared for a July 1 start if you're able to. So best practices for implementation, again, just be thinking about who needs to be at the table. Start right now. Start with cross-campus, cross-state leadership so you can start thinking about what that approval process will look like. Begin mapping your programs to those stackable credentials if you're not already doing that, and making sure that your staff is trained on what eligibility is for those different programs. If you do not know who your financial aid officer is at your campus or at your state level, I would encourage you to start getting to know them, because they're going to be your best friend in all of this, right? So what we don't want is that we go through all of this process, we identify these programs, and then at the very end, we don't have any students who actually receive the fund. And is it because they weren't eligible, or was it because we didn't know kind of how to process the award? And so really thinking about having your financial aid person at the helm of these discussions, I think is going to be greatly beneficial, because again, that FAFSA component is probably foreign to students who may be traditionally taking short-term programs. They've never been eligible for Pell Grant, and now they could be. And so really making sure that you're including them early on. What challenges will those students face when they actually start completing that application? And then again, that role of advising. I'm a part of another group, and the advisors at a college actually know about and understand what are the workforce demands in their state and in their region, so they can help advise students on the right programs to go into. And so this is going to be a great tool for your advisors if they're able to say, oh, you want to go into something short? Well, there's an opportunity for you, and there's funding to support it. So now that we kind of have all of that, survey data at our fingertips, and of course all of the work that Michelle and Mark have done around that non-credit space, what we really hope to do is pull all of that together and create some sort of toolkit for this group. So I think our next iteration of those small working groups may lead to some of this development of the toolkits, specifically for Workforce Pell. And so I anticipate that we will have a small working group, maybe specifically around Workforce Pell. And so what would you want in a toolkit, right? What kind of information would you want to see? Checklists, messaging templates, data tracking, tools of the trade. What do you want to see? Those are things that we're interested in as a working group, so that we can start building those out into our small working groups as well. Think of your call to action. So after today, after the negotiated rulemaking is over, at the end of this week, and then as it comes back in January, be thinking is, what in one immediate step can you take right now? Who can you invite to the table? What do you need to do to make sure that you're successful in 12 to 18 months, so that you're able to maybe actually award a Pell Grant to these students who are going to these programs? So, be thinking about, what can you do tomorrow to really get your state ahead of the game? And I'm right on time. I wanted to have about 10 minutes for discussion at the very end. So this is really just kind of open discussion. What do you want to see in a toolkit? Are there best practices that your state is already, including? What are you doing at the state level? Are there things that you're hearing through negotiated rulemaking that you're concerned about that we might need to tackle as a small working group? Those are all things that we're interested in hearing about. And so I will open it up for discussion at this point. And there's lots of chat, so I'm going to kind of go through. I think Catherine Finnegan provided quite a bit of information on the data component. Teresa asked, I'm curious how other states are viewing the role of the SHIO agencies in the rollout process and the ongoing program review information. That actually came up in negotiated rulemaking today as well. I think there's a partner from Arkansas who's at their SHIO, and I think he brought that up specifically. And I did make a note about that. I'm trying to look through my notes to see. But there, so the Higher Education Act still requires state authorization. So you'll still have to have that. So your state entity, like your Board of Regents, is still going to have to, like, I guess, approve these programs as well, is my understanding. But that definitely was a topic of discussion today in negotiated rulemaking. And Kim in Louisiana, so the two-year colleges and proprietary, we report student level data to the SHIO agency, and then we have data sharing agreements with different workforce partners. But again, we are going to have to look at the data that we're currently reporting to that state agency, because I think it needs to probably be more robust. Yes, I think all of the slides are going to be shared later on. Which states are the furthest along in terms of stackable mapping their short-term credentials to longer-term pathways? I'd have to look at the survey. It was a very small number of states who answered the survey, but I know in Louisiana we have so two things. One, we have a matrix. It's an IBC to credit matrix. So if a student completes an industry-based certification on the non-credit side, then it tracks to a credit course. So we have a little bit of stackability there, but I would encourage you to also look at your adult education providers, because a lot of them have short-term credentials that lead to those pathways, because for ATB purposes, you have to have an eligible career pathway for Title IV aid. And so adult ed kind of has already started creating some of those pathways. So they might be taking preparation for the high set, also taking an industry-based credential that also maps to a credit-bearing program. And so I think there's several different examples online as well that I gave from Louisiana, and it looks like Ohio also has an initiative as well that Candler put in the chat. A toolkit suggestion. Thank you, Julie, for that. Let's see, a version of what the financial aid folks need to concern them. Yes, agreed. I think the financial aid people, at the negotiated rulemaking table, or who are looking or listening, we're like, some of this stuff is very common to us. We already kind of know some of these answers, but to people who've never worked in this space, there's definitely going to be some work that there's going to be an education on both sides of the house, right? How does a financial aid administrator award aid to a non-credit program that they've never awarded it to? And then two, if you've never had financial aid, you've got to teach that group of people about those different financial aid opportunities. I actually have a PowerPoint that I use, and it's just like funding. And I go through every single funding opportunity that I can think of, both state and federal. And we kind of shop it around, and we do it at conferences. We have a certified workforce developer class that we do every year for workforce, and we talk about it there. So there really does have to be kind of a huge communication flow that's happening in a lot of different directions, so people are prepared. It looks like Crystal mentioned at the SUNY system, they have their own database of credit for prior learning, and they also accept evaluations through ACE and NCCRS. Okay, that got us through the chat, so that's a good thing. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And I am going to open it up for any other questions. Feel free to come off mute, put anything else in the chat. And if not, I will turn it back over to Michelle.
So that's a lot of great information. I think very helpful. And there's so much to process, but I don't know if does anyone else have any other thoughts or comments to add to this? It's a great wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much, Amy and Paula, for putting this all together. Um, okay. Julie, do you want to come off mute and just add any other thoughts from the chat?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, you mentioned state authorization in your presentation, so I thought, using that as an example, there were some very specific guidelines that were prepared for institutions and states as to if you make the choice to administer it in this way, you need this. So we saw states having to work with their legislatures, on creating entirely new, functions that existed at the state level. Now, considering that most of this relies on our workforce, our workforce boards and the work that's already being done in workforce development, it's probably not to that extreme. But there might be some need to say, hey, here are some common pathways that states are taking and are thinking about this work. And if you're interested in doing it this way, then you have to consider these attributes, or, these are the conditions that were in place that allowed the state to do it that way. So with some of these models that you might, be offering up in in any type of guidance, that understanding the context that allowed them to do that, to go back to our example, there's a reason why California isn't in state authorization, right? And for those of us that have been in this space for a long time, we know why, right? There are reasons why some states came in very late because they had to actually create new laws and new statutes to be able to join. So I think that those are important contexts to provide if you're going to be providing any type of exemplars, as far as how states are working through this.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like the ETPLs, the eligible training programs. I know in Louisiana they're redoing kind of what that whole process looks like for us, and so we are likely not going to rely on the ETPLs. We're going to rely on something different, we think. But that's a very good point. There's a lot of state authorization. The other thing that came up, I think, at a recent conference in Lumina, they talked about the state authorization and just making sure there's a balance. You don't want the federal government to say this is a new program, but then your state makes it so difficult that you can't actually get an approved program through. And so I think there's a lot of discussion at that state level on what their role is in the approval of these programs.
Great.
Or how strict they're going to be.
Right. A lot to be determined. So, well, stay tuned. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Let's see, is there something else that came up in the chat? Yeah, so that's wonderful. Thank you, Elliot and Kate, for joining us to share an update on Credlens. And again, thanks to Amy and Paula for putting together this great presentation and for leading our specialized working group along with Vlad Bassis, who's also been a great leader for us in sharing practices around non-credit data. So more to come. Please share with us ideas, thoughts, suggestions for things that we'll do in the next round of the working groups. And take care, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. And we will see you again soon.
Bye. Have a great afternoon.